July 24, 1943. The USS Tenosa, a Gato-class submarine, prowled the waters east of Truk Lagoon. Commander Lawson Parrott Daspit stood in the conning tower, his hands gripping the periscope handles as sweat dripped down his face despite the ventilation fans. Through the lens, he watched a prize that would make any submarine captain's pulse race. The Tonin Maru No. 3, a 19,000-ton Japanese tanker, fat with fuel destined for the Imperial fleet. She was alone, unescorted, wallowing through calm seas like a wounded whale. Daspit had stalked her for hours, calculating angles, speed, and distance with the precision of a hunter who had done this 100 times before. The setup was perfect. Range, 1,800 yards. Angle on the bow, 90 degrees. A textbook shot. He gave the order. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. 15 Mark 14 torpedoes, America's primary submarine weapon, streaked through the water toward the massive hull. Each torpedo cost $10,000. Each carried over 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. Each represented months of engineering, testing, and the faith of an entire nation's submarine force. Daspit watched through the periscope as the first torpedo struck the tanker amidships. A column of water erupted. The ship shuddered but did not slow. The second torpedo hit. Another geyser. Still, the tanker steamed on. The third hit. A fourth. The Tonin Maru refused to sink. Daspit's confidence turned to confusion, then to cold fury. He fired again and again, adjusting depth settings, changing angles, closing the range to 800 yards. 11 direct hits. 11 explosions that should have torn the tanker apart. Yet she remained afloat, listing but defiant. If we stop remembering their sacrifice, it's as if they died twice. Please subscribe to this channel so their stories are never forgotten. With only 2 torpedoes remaining, Daspit made a decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. He surfaced the Tenosa within 500 yards of the crippled tanker and fired his deck gun, riddling her with shells until she finally began to settle. But he kept one torpedo, one single Mark 14, unfired, locked in its tube. When the Tenosa returned to Pearl Harbor, Daspit carried that torpedo directly to Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, and spoke words that had been building in the throats of submarine captains for nearly 2 years. "Admiral, our torpedoes don't work." This was not a complaint. It was not frustration born of bad luck or poor aim. It was an accusation backed by meticulous logs, by patrol reports filled with tales of torpedoes that ran too deep, detonators that failed to explode, and targets that should have been destroyed but sailed away unharmed. In that moment, standing before Lockwood with a single torpedo as evidence, Daspit had delivered the final proof of a crisis that had been killing American submariners and crippling the war effort since the first day of combat. The weapon upon which the entire submarine campaign depended was fatally flawed, and the institutions responsible had known it, denied it, and covered it up for years. What followed would not be a story of heroic invention, but of bureaucratic betrayal, institutional arrogance, and the desperate struggle of men at sea to survive a weapon designed to protect them but had instead become their curse. The Mark 14 torpedo crisis was not solved by a brilliant engineer in a laboratory. It was solved by submariners who refused to die quietly, who tested their weapons under fire, who risked court-martial to prove what their superiors refused to believe. This is the story of how America's submarines, sent into battle with broken weapons, finally became the deadliest force in the Pacific. But the path to that transformation was paved with fury, blood, and the wreckage of ships that should have been sunk but were allowed to escape. In the years before the Second World War, the United States Navy poured its faith and resources into a weapon it believed would dominate the Pacific, the Mark 14 torpedo. Developed throughout the 1930s by the Bureau of Ordnance, the Mark 14 was an engineering marvel on paper. 20 feet long, weighing over 3,000 pounds, it carried a warhead packed with 643 pounds of Torpex, an explosive compound 50% more powerful than TNT. Its steam turbine engine could drive it through the water at 46 knots for over 4,000 yards. But the true innovation, the feature that justified years of development and millions of dollars, was the Mark VI magnetic influence exploder. The Mark VI was a masterpiece of ambition. Unlike contact detonators that required a torpedo to physically strike a ship's hull, the magnetic exploder was designed to sense the steel mass of an enemy vessel as the torpedo passed beneath it. At the precise moment when the weapon crossed under the target's keel, the exploder would trigger, detonating the warhead directly beneath the ship where the hull was weakest and unarmored. The resulting explosion, channeled upward by the water, would break the target's spine, snapping it in half with a single blow. In theory, one torpedo could do what 10 conventional weapons could not: kill a battleship with a single shot. The Bureau of Ordnance, headquartered in Washington and insulated from the realities of combat, believed in the Mark VI with religious fervor. Its chief designers had spent years perfecting the magnetic sensor, calibrating it to detect the minute changes in Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull. They spoke of it in glowing terms as a revolution in naval warfare, a weapon so advanced that it would render the enemy's armor obsolete. But there was a problem, one that would haunt the submarine force for years. The Mark XIV had never been tested under realistic combat conditions. Live fire testing was expensive. Each torpedo cost $10,000, equivalent to over $200,000 today. The Bureau of Ordnance, operating under peacetime budgets and obsessed with secrecy, refused to expend torpedoes in comprehensive trials. Instead, they conducted limited tests using dummy warheads, inert weapons that could be recovered and reused. These tests measured speed, depth control, and gyroscope accuracy. They did not measure whether the torpedo would actually explode when it reached the target. The magnetic exploder, the most complex and unproven component, was tested only a handful of times, always in controlled environments, always in the magnetic field of the continental United States, which differed significantly from the fields near the equator where the Pacific War would be fought. The submariners themselves, the men who would carry these weapons into battle, were never consulted. Captains and torpedo officers raised questions during training exercises. They noted erratic depth keeping, they observed that torpedoes frequently ran deeper than set, and they reported failures in test firings. But the Bureau of Ordnance dismissed these concerns as operator error, as the complaints of men who did not understand the sophisticated technology they had been given. The designers in Washington knew better. They had the equations, the blueprints, the calculations. The weapon was perfect. Any failures, they insisted, were the fault of the crews. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the American submarine force went to war armed with a weapon its designers worshipped and its operators distrusted. The first patrols were launched with confidence. Submarines slipped out of Pearl Harbor, Brisbane, and Fremantle, their tubes loaded with Mark XIV torpedoes, their crews eager to strike back against the enemy. But within weeks, the reports began to arrive. Torpedoes fired at perfect angles at point-blank range were passing harmlessly beneath Japanese transports. Others struck targets with dull thuds, failing to detonate. Captains watched in disbelief as their fish, their precious weapons, malfunctioned again and again. Commander Tyrrell Jacobs, aboard the USS Sargo, fired 13 torpedoes at a Japanese convoy in January 1942. Not one exploded. Lieutenant Commander Chester Smith on the USS Swordfish attacked a cruiser at close range and heard his torpedoes clang against the hull without detonating. The reports multiplied. The USS Skipjack, the USS Seawolf, the USS Growler, patrol after patrol, the story was the same. Torpedoes that missed, torpedoes that failed, and targets that escaped. The submariners were not fools. They knew what they had seen. They knew the difference between a miss and a malfunction. They filled their patrol reports with detailed accounts, with diagrams, with angry marginal notes demanding answers. But the Bureau of Ordnance, sitting in Washington 3,000 miles from the nearest combat zone, refused to believe them. The designers insisted the problem was not the weapon but the men. Captains were accused of poor fire control. Torpedo officers were blamed for incorrect settings. Training was declared inadequate. The institution that had built the Mark XIV could not accept that it had built a failure. By mid-1942, fury was building in the submarine fleet. Men were dying. Patrols were returning empty-handed. Japanese convoys sailed unmolested because American torpedoes refused to work. And still, the Bureau of Ordnance insisted that nothing was wrong. The Mark 14, they declared, was the finest torpedo in the world. The problem, they repeated, was with the crews. This was the poison that infected the American submarine campaign in its first year. Not enemy depth charges, not superior Japanese tactics, but a weapon that did not work and a bureaucracy that refused to admit it. The submariners of 1942 were not just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting their own navy, their own institutions, their own weapons. And they were losing. The crisis reached its breaking point not in the halls of Washington, but in the depths of the Pacific, where men who were supposed to be hunters had become prey to their own equipment. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who assumed command of the Pacific Submarine Force in early 1943, was not a patient man. Unlike the bureaucrats in Washington, Lockwood had spent his career at sea. He knew submarines. He knew submariners. And he knew when he was being lied to. Within weeks of taking command, Lockwood began compiling the evidence. He read every patrol report. He interviewed returning captains. He listened to their rage, their frustration, their detailed accounts of torpedoes that struck targets and did not explode, of weapons that ran 10 feet deeper than their settings, of magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely or not at all. The patterns were undeniable. This was not operator error. This was systemic failure. Lockwood's first target was the depth-keeping problem. Submariners had consistently reported that Mark 14 torpedoes ran deeper than their set depth, often by 10 feet or more. The Bureau of Ordnance had dismissed these complaints, insisting that the torpedoes ran true. But Lockwood ordered independent testing. In June 1942, at the submarine base in Albany, Australia, his team conducted live fire trials against nets suspended at known depths. They fired torpedoes set to run at 10 feet. The weapons passed beneath the nets at 20 feet. They adjusted the settings. The torpedoes still ran deep. The tests were repeated, refined, and documented with photographic evidence. The results were incontrovertible. The Mark 14 ran an average of 10 feet deeper than its depth setting. The cause was absurdly simple. The Bureau of Ordnance had tested the torpedo's depth mechanism using dummy warheads, inert weapons lighter than the live combat versions. When the actual Torpex warheads were installed, the added weight caused the torpedo to run deeper. No one in Washington had thought to account for this. No one had tested a fully armed weapon. The fix was equally simple. Submariners began setting their torpedoes 10 feet shallower than their desired running depth. Problem solved. But this was only the first layer of failure. The second problem was the contact exploder, the backup detonator that was supposed to trigger if the magnetic exploder failed. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, captains reported direct hits that produced no explosions. Torpedoes struck enemy hulls with audible clangs and bounced off harmlessly. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted this was impossible. The Mark 6 contact exploder, they claimed, was reliable and thoroughly tested. But again, Lockwood refused to accept empty assurances. In September 1943, after Commander Daspit's devastating patrol aboard the Tenosa, Lockwood ordered tests of the contact exploder itself. His team fired torpedoes at perpendicular angles into submerged steel plates anchored off the coast of Hawaii. When the torpedoes struck at 90-degree angles, simulating a perfect broadside hit, the contact exploders failed 70% of the time. The firing pin, which was supposed to be driven into the detonator by the force of impact, was instead crushed and jammed by that same force. The harder the torpedo hit, the more likely it was to fail. It was a design flaw so fundamental, so catastrophic, that it beggared belief. Lockwood's men bypassed the Bureau of Ordnance entirely. Submarine tenders in the Pacific began modifying the contact exploders themselves, lightening the firing pins, altering the springs, field testing the changes under combat conditions. By late 1943, the contact exploder problem had been solved, not by the institution that designed it, but by the men who had to use it. But the magnetic exploder, the crown jewel of the Mark 6, remained. And it was the deadliest flaw of all. The magnetic influence exploder had been designed to detect the steel mass of a ship's hull and detonate beneath it. In practice, it detonated erratically. Sometimes it triggered too early, exploding harmlessly hundreds of yards from the target. Other times it failed to trigger at all, passing directly beneath enemy ships without detonating. The problem was the Earth's magnetic field itself, which varied wildly across the Pacific. The exploder had been calibrated for the magnetic field near the continental United States. In the equatorial waters where most combat occurred, the field was weaker, distorted, unpredictable. The magnetic exploder could not compensate. Worse, the torpedo's own steel casing and internal components created localized magnetic fields that interfered with the sensor. Temperature changes, vibrations from the torpedo's engine, even the angle of the weapon as it moved through the water, all of these variables affected the magnetic exploder's performance. It was a weapon designed in a laboratory, calibrated under controlled conditions, and utterly unsuited to the chaos of combat. Lockwood and his staff pleaded with the Bureau of Ordnance to deactivate the magnetic feature and rely solely on contact detonation. The Bureau refused. They insisted the magnetic exploder was essential. They accused Lockwood of incompetence, of failing to train his men properly. They threatened to relieve him of command. But Lockwood had allies, submariners in the field, captains who had survived patrols only by luck, began deactivating the magnetic exploder on their own authority. They violated regulations, risked court-martial, and went into battle with contact-only detonation. The results were immediate. Suddenly, torpedoes that struck enemy ships exploded. Suddenly, convoys that should have escaped were torn apart. Suddenly, the American submarine force began to sink tonnage at rates that shocked both the Navy and the Japanese. By mid-1944, the magnetic exploder had been officially deactivated across the entire Pacific submarine fleet. The weapon the Bureau of Ordnance had spent a decade perfecting was abandoned as worthless. The transformation was staggering. In 1942, American submarines had fired thousands of torpedoes and sunk only a fraction of their intended targets. By 1944, with the depth-keeping problem solved, the contact exploder repaired, and the magnetic exploder deactivated, submarine effectiveness increased tenfold. The number of enemy ships sunk per torpedo fired skyrocketed. The tonnage of Japanese merchant shipping destroyed climbed from a trickle to a flood. Japan, an island nation dependent on imported resources, began to starve. This was not the result of new technology. It was the result of fixing old technology that should never have been broken in the first place. The Mark 14 torpedo, once the most sophisticated weapon in the American arsenal, had been crippled by institutional arrogance, by a refusal to test, by a bureaucracy that valued its own reputation over the lives of the men it served. And when those men finally took matters into their own hands, when they bypassed the system and fixed the weapon themselves, they unleashed devastation on an empire. The submarines had not become deadlier because of innovation. They had become deadlier because they were finally allowed to work. By the summer of 1944, the American submarine force had been reborn. The fixes were simple, brutal in their simplicity. Torpedoes were set 10 feet shallower to compensate for depth-keeping errors. Contact exploders were modified in the field by machinists working aboard submarine tenders anchored in forward bases. The magnetic influence feature, that masterpiece of engineering hubris, was deactivated entirely. What remained was a weapon that finally did what it was supposed to do: explode when it hit something. The results were not gradual. They were immediate and catastrophic for Japan. In January 1944, American submarines sank 43 Japanese merchant ships totaling over 200,000 tons. By June, that number had doubled. In October, it doubled again. The submarines that had spent 2 years firing duds were now tearing through Japanese convoy routes like wolves through a flock. The Empire of Japan, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, depended entirely on its merchant fleet to transport oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and iron ore from China. Without those supplies, the war machine would grind to a halt. The factories would go silent. The people would starve. And the American submarines, finally armed with working torpedoes, were about to cut every artery. Commander Richard O'Kane, skipper of the USS Tang, became the embodiment of this new lethality. O'Kane was not a cautious man. He was aggressive, calculating, and utterly fearless. In 5 war patrols between January and October 1944, the Tang sank 33 Japanese ships, more than any other submarine in the Pacific Fleet. O'Kane's tactics were surgical. He penetrated convoy screens, positioned himself inside the formation, and fired spreads of torpedoes at point-blank range. On the night of June 24, 1944, off the coast of Japan, he attacked a convoy of 6 freighters escorted by destroyers. Within 20 minutes, he had fired 8 torpedoes and sank 4 ships. The remaining vessels scattered in panic as the Tang slipped beneath the surface and escaped. O'Kane's success was not luck. It was the result of weapons that finally worked as designed. His patrol reports, once filled with frustration and rage over malfunctioning torpedoes, now read like inventories of destruction. Ships sunk, tonnage destroyed, targets eliminated with clinical efficiency. The Tang's crew, once forced to watch enemy vessels sail away unharmed, now witnessed explosions that broke freighters in half, that sent tankers to the bottom in flames, that turned troop transports into coffins for thousands of Japanese soldiers who would never reach their destinations. But O'Kane's story would also reveal the limits of the weapon's transformation. On the night of October 24, 1944, during his 5th patrol, the Tang attacked a Japanese convoy in the Formosa Strait. O'Kane fired his final 2 torpedoes at a troop transport. The first torpedo struck true, detonating amidships and ripping the vessel apart. The second torpedo, the 24th fired on that patrol, malfunctioned. His gyroscope failed. The weapon veered sharply, turned in a circle, and ran hot, straight, and normal directly back toward the Tang. O'Kane saw it coming through the periscope. He screamed orders to dive, to turn, to evade, but there was no time. The torpedo struck the Tang's stern, detonated, and sent the submarine to the bottom. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 survived, O'Kane among them, pulled from the water by the Japanese and sent to a prisoner of war camp. The weapon that had made him the most lethal submarine captain in the Pacific had killed him. This is not just history. These were real lives lost, real families destroyed. If this moved you, please subscribe and help keep their voices alive. The Tang's loss was a reminder that even fixed, the Mark 14 remained imperfect. Gyroscope failures, though rare, still occurred. Torpedoes still occasionally ran erratic. But the difference between 1942 and 1944 was undeniable. In the early years, failure was the norm. By the war's end, failure was the exception. And the tonnage figures told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, American submarines sank just over 700,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, with the depth problem partially solved, that number rose to 1.5 million tons. In 1944, with all 3 major flaws corrected, submarines sank over 3 million tons. By the end of the war, the American submarine force had destroyed 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping, over 5 million tons, along with over 200 Japanese warships, including 1 battleship and 8 aircraft carriers. The submarines had done what the surface fleet, the Army Air Forces, and the Marine Corps combined could not. They had strangled Japan's ability to sustain the war. The human cost was staggering. 16,000 Japanese merchant sailors died. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned aboard troop transports sent to the bottom. Entire convoys vanished without trace, their cargoes of fuel, food, and ammunition lost forever. Japanese civilians, dependent on imported rice, began to starve as fewer and fewer supply ships reached home ports. By 1945, Japan's fuel reserves had been reduced to a trickle. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of gasoline. Warships remained in port because there was no oil to steam. The industrial cities fell silent as raw materials stopped arriving. The empire, once confident in its ability to dominate the Pacific, had been reduced to an island under siege, cut off and dying. The irony was bitter. Japan had entered the war believing that American submarines, constrained by international treaties and humanitarian concerns, would never wage unrestricted submarine warfare. They believed the Americans would follow the rules, would surface before attacking merchant ships, would allow crews to abandon before sinking unarmed vessels. But on December 7, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz had issued a single order to the Pacific Submarine Force: execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no mercy, sink everything. The Japanese had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had sent its submarines to devour an empire. Yet even as the tonnage mounted, even as Japanese shipping lanes became graveyards, the institutional rot that had created the torpedo crisis lingered. The Bureau of Ordnance never formally admitted fault. No one was court-martialed. No careers were destroyed. The engineers and administrators who had dismissed the submariners' complaints, who had insisted the Mark 14 was flawless, who had threatened to relieve Admiral Lockwood for daring to question their designs, all of them remained in their positions, untouched, unrepentant. They quietly accepted the field modifications. They allowed the magnetic exploder to be deactivated. They permitted the contact exploder to be redesigned. But they never issued apologies. They never acknowledged that their arrogance had cost lives, had prolonged the war, had sent men into battle with weapons designed to fail. The submariners themselves bore the scars. Of the 288 American submarines that went on patrol during the war, 52 were lost. Over 3,600 submariners died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. 22% of the men who went to sea in submarines never came home. Many of those deaths could be traced directly to the torpedo crisis. Submarines forced to close to point-blank range because their torpedoes would not detonate from safe distances. Submarines forced to make multiple attacks on the same target because their weapons failed, exposing them to counterattacks by destroyers and aircraft. Submarines lost because they could not sink their attackers quickly enough, because the torpedoes they fired in self-defense malfunctioned at the moment of greatest need. Commander Howard Gilmore, captain of the USS Growler, died in February 1943 after being wounded on the bridge during a surface engagement with a Japanese patrol boat. He had surfaced to finish off a damaged freighter with his deck gun because his torpedoes had failed to sink it. His last words, shouted down the hatch as he bled out on the deck, were, "Take her down." The Growler submerged, leaving Gilmore behind, and escaped. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. But he should never have been on the surface. He should never have needed his deck gun. A working torpedo would have sunk that freighter from 1,000 yards away, safely, invisibly, and Gilmore would have lived. These were the hidden casualties of institutional failure, the men who died not because the enemy was superior, but because their own navy had sent them into battle with broken weapons and refused to believe them when they reported the truth. The bitterness ran deep. Even decades after the war, submarine veterans spoke of the Mark 14 crisis with anger that had not faded. They remembered the patrol reports that were ignored. They remembered the captains who were blamed for the failures of engineers. They remembered the targets that escaped, the convoys that sailed on, the Japanese ships that should have been sunk but were allowed to carry troops and supplies to kill more Americans on distant islands. And yet, despite everything, they had won. Not because the system worked. Not because the institution supported them, but because they had refused to accept failure. They had tested their own weapons. They had modified their own equipment. They had bypassed the chain of command and fixed the problems themselves. Admiral Lockwood had risked his career to force the issue. Submariners like Commander Daspit had documented the failures with meticulous precision. Machinists and torpedo officers aboard submarine tenders had redesigned exploders in workshops lit by bare bulbs, using tools and improvisation, solving in weeks what the Bureau of Ordnance had failed to solve in years. The transformation of the American submarine force was not a story of American ingenuity triumphing through brilliant invention. It was a story of American stubbornness triumphing over American incompetence. It was proof that wars are not won by the side with the best technology, but by the side that is willing to admit when its technology fails and fix it before the enemy does. Japan never solved its own submarine torpedo problems. Germany's magnetic exploders remained unreliable throughout the war. But America, through sheer bloody-minded determination, had turned a disaster into a weapon of annihilation. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan was already defeated. The cities were ashes. The fleet was destroyed. The army was scattered across a dozen dying fronts. But the true killing blow had been delivered not by fire from the sky, but by silent hunters beneath the waves. The submarines, once crippled by their own weapons, had become the most effective instrument of economic warfare in history. They had sunk an empire. Thank you for watching. Most of them received no medals, no monuments, only stories left behind. If this touched your heart, please subscribe so they will not be forgotten. The legacy of the Mark 14 torpedo crisis extends far beyond the Second World War. It became a case study taught at the Naval War College, analyzed in military academies, cited in books on leadership and institutional failure. The lessons were stark and unforgiving. Trust the men in the field. Test your weapons under realistic conditions. Never let bureaucracy override evidence. Admit failure quickly, fix it faster, and never punish the people who tell you the truth. Yet those lessons, however clear, have been forgotten and relearned in every generation. The same patterns repeat. The same institutional arrogance resurfaces. The same refusal to believe the operators. The same insistence that the engineers know better. The same delays and denials and cover-ups. The Mark 14 crisis was not unique. It was a symptom of a deeper disease, one that infects every large institution that grows too distant from the realities it is meant to serve. In the decades after the war, the men who had fought with broken torpedoes slowly faded. Admiral Lockwood retired, wrote his memoirs, and spent his final years advocating for the submarine force he had commanded. Commander Daspit left the Navy and returned to civilian life, carrying with him the memory of 11 torpedoes that struck but did not kill. Richard O'Kane, pulled from the water after the Tang sank, survived 4 years in a Japanese prison camp, returned home, and received the Medal of Honor. He never spoke much about the torpedo that had killed his boat. There was nothing left to say. The submarines themselves, the Gado-class and Balao-class boats that had prowled the Pacific, were decommissioned, scrapped, or sold to Allied navies. A few were preserved as memorials, their hulls rusting quietly in harbors, silent witnesses to a war that had demanded everything from the men who sailed them. Visitors walk through their cramped compartments, past the torpedo rooms where Mark 14s once waited in their tubes, and they marvel at how small the spaces were, how claustrophobic, how any man could have lived and fought in such confines. But the tonnage figures remain. 5 million tons of Japanese shipping sunk. 55% of Japan's merchant fleet destroyed. An empire starved, strangled, and brought to its knees not by invasion but by isolation. The American submarine force had achieved what no other weapon system in the war could claim: complete strategic dominance over an entire theater. And they had done it despite, not because of, the institutions that were supposed to support them. The Mark 14 torpedo, fixed and functional, went on to serve for decades. Modified versions remained in the U.S. arsenal into the 1980s. The contact exploder, redesigned by submarine tenders in the Pacific, became the standard for a generation of weapons. The lessons learned from depth-keeping failures informed the design of every torpedo that followed. But the magnetic exploder, that crown jewel of pre-war engineering, was abandoned entirely. It had failed so completely, so catastrophically, that no one ever tried to resurrect it. The idea was sound, the execution was poison, and the men who had died because of it were never coming back. In the end, the story of how America's submarines became 10 times deadlier is not a story of invention. It is a story of repair. It is the story of men who went to war with a weapon that should have worked but didn't, who documented every failure with precision, who demanded answers when their superiors offered only excuses, and who finally took matters into their own hands when the institution refused to act. It is a story of courage, not in the face of the enemy, but in the face of their own navy. And it is a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one across the battlefield, but the one who sends you into battle unprepared and refuses to admit it. The submarines prowled the Pacific for 4 years. They hunted in darkness and silence. They struck without warning. They sank ships, killed sailors, and destroyed an empire's ability to sustain itself. But before they could do any of that, they had to survive the weapon they carried. The Mark 14 torpedo crisis was the hidden battle of the Pacific War, fought not against Japan but against incompetence, arrogance, and institutional blindness. And when the submariners finally won that battle, when the torpedoes finally worked, they unleashed devastation on a scale that changed the course of history. The mathematics of death had been rewritten not by genius, but by refusal to accept failure. The submarines had become 10 times deadlier not because they were given something new, but because they were finally allowed to use what they already had. And in the frozen depths of the Pacific, where the water is dark and the pressure crushes steel, that was all the edge they needed.